Welcome to a world where ancient voices still whisper through the winds. Step into the timeless stories of native tribes, filled with sacred rituals, powerful legends, and deep-rooted wisdom. Grab your favorite drink, get comfortable, and prepare to walk the path of spirit, strength, and mystery. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Your roots matter here. If these stories move you, give this video a like and subscribe for more sacred journeys. The drumbeat are calling. Let the journey begin. They lived in houses longer than some rivers run wide. Wooden sanctuaries where voices echoed in prayer, counsel, and memory. They were peacemakers, yet warriors, erased, yet everywhere. Today, some of their descendants are rebuilding a nation. From the ashes of treaties never honored, a people still fighting to return to lands stolen twice, before there were borders. Before maps sliced the land into counties and states, there was the fire, steady, ancient, and alive. It burned. Inside the Cayuga longhouse, not just as flame, but as heartbeat. The longhouse was more than wood and bark. It was memory. It was a spine made of cedar, stretched across time. Beneath its rafters, generations breathed together. Elders spoke while children listened. The smoke curled upward, carrying prayers. No one needed to write down. The Cayuga were one of the original 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, keepers of the central fire, both in geography and in spirit. Their longhouses were homes, yes, but they were also schools, governments, and cathedrals. Every family had its place along the hearth, and every hearth had its keeper. But the fire in the center, that belonged to everyone. It symbolized unity, continuity, and counsel. It warmed not just bodies, but decisions. In this world, women carried the weight of wisdom. Cayuga society was matrilineal. The clan mothers chose the chiefs. They also removed them when needed, not with anger, but with calm certainty. Power wasn't force, it was responsibility, and in that balance, life found rhythm. The longhouse didn't echo with shouting. It hummed with agreement. Disputes weren't battles. They were woven into understanding, like fibers in a basket. Children didn't grow up in silence. They grew up surrounded by songs, by stories passed from mouths older than memory. Every tale had a lesson. Every pause had meaning. You learned not just what was said, but how to listen, how to feel the weight of a word. Grandparents taught, with glances, with pauses, with patient hands, showing you how to sharpen a tool or carry water without spilling. Outside, the forests fed the people. The rivers spoke in silver. Cedar trees weren't just trees, they were protection, spirit, medicine. The Cayuga moved with the land, not against it. They took what they needed and left the rest, always aware that everything was connected. The corn, the deer, the laughter after meals. The longhouse didn't stand alone. It was part of the forest's breath. But peace never lasts without challenge. When Europeans arrived, they brought with them new rules, drawn in ink and sealed with wax. They couldn't understand a government without kings, a system that needed no prisons. They saw the longhouse and didn't see a nation. They saw land, not legacy. They came with maps and muskets, and each treaty burned away a piece of that central fire. Homes were razed, forests cut down. The Cayuga were pushed out, scattered like coals from a kicked hearth. Yet somehow, the fire never died. Even in exile, the Cayuga carried it in language, in memory, in the way a story is told just before dusk. They gathered in kitchens, in churches, on porches, recreating the shape of the longhouse without timber. When the government erased them from the land, they carved themselves back into it with willpower and song. When their language was labeled extinct, they whispered it anyway, syllable by syllable, to their children. In recent years, some Cayuga have rebuilt longhouses, not replicas, but revivals, places to teach, to gather, to remember. The fires inside are real. The benches are cedar. The laughter sounds like it did 200 years ago. And when someone steps through the door, there's a pause, a breath, because this is more than just a space. It's a return to sit by a Cayuga fire, is to understand that culture isn't something buried in the past. It lives in the present, in the warmth between people, in the pauses between words. The longhouse teaches us that tradition isn't fragile, it's fireproof. If you know how to tend it, and tend it they did. The Cayuga didn't just survive, they adapted. They brought old laws into modern spaces. They taught governance in classrooms. They practiced peace where others demanded conflict. Their strength was never in conquest, it was in cohesion. In knowing that one voice isn't enough, but many, singing together, can echo for generations. The fire under the longhouse still flickers. Maybe smaller now, maybe more quietly, but it burns in ceremony. It burns in a child learning the language of her great-grandmother. It burns in the Cayuga's return to their homeland, 1 acre at a time. And if you stand very still, just outside the longhouse, you can hear it. The heartbeat, the warmth, the invitation, because the Cayuga story doesn't start in tragedy. It starts in unity, and what was built in fire cannot be broken by time. Next comes the sound that carried stories, farther than voices, the shells that held treaties, and the beads that whispered truth. It begins as a trickle in the hills of upstate New York, unassuming, quiet, like the first breath of a story long forgotten. The river is called Cayuga, just like the people it once cradled. But make no mistake, this is not a passive stream. This river remembers. Its currents carry whispers, its banks hold footprints older than memory, and its bends curve like the spine of a people who refuse to break. Long before towns rose and highways sliced through, the trees, the Cayuga Nation, called these waters home. The river fed them, bathed them, taught them. It was not a border, it was a bond. Fish swam upstream like returning kin. Canoes glided across it like slow-moving prayers. When children splashed and elders watched from the shore, they weren't just playing. They were part of something sacred, a cycle that spoke in water instead of words. To the Cayuga, the river was a storyteller. It knew things no settler ever asked, where the turtles nested, where the spirits came to speak, where the best reeds grew for weaving baskets that would carry food, and later fragments of a culture nearly erased. The water glimmered with more than sunlight. It shimmered with remembrance. They believed that everything had spirit, the trees, the wind, the deer, even the stones. But the river was a living witness. It watched as seasons changed, as births and burials passed through its reflection. Every ripple was a message, every whirlpool a warning. Then came the time of severing, land deeds, chains of ink, broken treaties signed with cold hands. The Cayuga were forced off the land, but not the water. You see, the river can't be fenced in. It doesn't care for lines on paper. It keeps flowing, even when hearts stop. As white towns rose along its banks, the Cayuga faded from view, but not from memory. Not from the river's memory. The old stories say that when the treaties were broken, the river ran red. Not from blood, but from the rust of betrayal, from the sorrow in the soil. The fish grew fewer, the reeds thinned, yet the river didn't stop. Instead, it began to hold the pain. Like a vessel to full, it became heavy with absence. Still, the Cayuga returned. They returned in dreams first, whispered memories from grandparents who pointed downstream and said, "That's where we used to sing." Then they returned in body, in ceremonies held by the water, in lawsuits demanding the land, in songs sung back into the sky, and the river welcomed them, not with a roar, but with a pulse, a familiarity, a sense that even after all the silence, something remained, something waited. Today, the Cayuga still gather near its shores, not in long lines, but in circles, small, intentional, sacred circles. The river listens like it always has. It doesn't judge who came back late. It just holds space for grief, for hope, for a people replanting their roots. One elder once said, "We were gone, but the water knew us." That's how deep the connection runs. Deeper than laws, deeper than maps. Because the river was never just a natural feature. It was, and still is, a part of the Cayuga soul. If you stand at its edge at sunrise, you'll hear more than birdsong. You'll hear the rhythm of paddles that once danced across the surface. You'll hear laughter, chants, and maybe even a name the wind has carried for 100 years. In schools across the region, children now learn what was almost lost. Not just names and dates, but relationships. Relationships with land, with water, with memory. They're taught that the river isn't just history, it's living heritage, a mirror that reflects both loss and resilience. Even climate change can't wash away what the river holds. Yes, the floods come more often now, the banks erode, but the spirit, it stays. You cannot drown what was born of spirit. For the Cayuga, the river has become a bridge, not just between shores, but between eras. It links the stories told in life with those typed on smartphones. It connects the grandmothers who sang lullabies by candlelight with the youth who now live stream ceremonies to relatives living far from home. Through all of this, the river flows on, never forgetting dot. So when you see it, don't just see water. See memory, see defiance, see love. The river is not just what once was, it's what still is. And if you listen, really listen, you'll hear it calling them home. Next, we follow that call beyond water, beyond land, into something more fragile, the beads that spoke when voices couldn't. Before the Cayuga men ever raised their voices in the great councils, a woman whispered first in the shadow of the longhouse fire, while children slept and stars blinked quietly through the gaps in the bark roof. Cayuga women held the power to shape the future. They were not just caretakers or storytellers. They were the soul of the nation, and from their lips came the names that would echo through generations. You see, in the Cayuga world, leadership wasn't something seized by force. It wasn't won in battle or bought with wealth. It was given, and only a woman, a clan mother, had the right to give it. This wasn't symbolism. This wasn't soft power. This was law, as old as the roots of the Tree of Peace. The Cayuga are one of the original 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, often called the Iroquois. And in that confederacy, power flowed through women like water through soil. The clan mother held the sacred duty to choose her people's chief. She could name him, and just as importantly, she could take his name back. She was the balance, too. The council, the flame that ensured warriors did not forget wisdom, and her word, it was final. This chapter isn't about a single woman. but about many, though one name still stands, like a cedar in the storm, Jaconyasasa. She was not Cayuga by blood, but her legacy shaped them all. Known as the Mother of Nations, Jaconyasasa was the first to welcome the peacemaker, the prophet who united the Iroquois Confederacy. She fed him, she listened, and it was she who insisted that women must have a voice in this new alliance of nations. Without her, there would be no great law of peace, no council fire burning in unity, no balance between masculine power and feminine wisdom. The Cayuga never forgot that. They built their own structure with this balance stitched deep into its bones. In every Cayuga clan, descent flowed through the mother. Children belonged to her line, not the father's. A woman's clan identity shaped the next generation, its names, its roles, its responsibilities. And among these, women, the eldest, the clan mother, held the spiritual compass. When a chief died or was removed, the clan mother didn't simply appoint another. She watched, she waited, she observed the men of her clan. She looked for patience, integrity, compassion, and when she found it, she chose. The new chief would kneel before her, and she would place on him the title of leadership, not just a name, but a living role with sacred expectations. The chief became her speaker, her extension, but he never outranked her. He couldn't even open a council without her blessing, and if he ever betrayed that trust, if he became proud, violent, or careless with the people, the clan mother had the right to knock off his antlers, a symbolic phrase meaning she could strip him of his role, not with rage, but with ceremony, not as revenge, but as restoration. Even in times of war, when others saw women as helpless, the Cayuga saw clarity. Warriors left home with a mother's words in their ears. Counsel. Fires burned with a woman's wisdom circling above like smoke. And even today, Cayuga women still hold the memory of that authority, even when history books forget to mention it. Modern Cayuga women walk to roads now, one paved with memory, one littered with erasure. Colonial laws tried to strip them of land, voice, and rights, branding Native women as wards, not leaders. But still, the old songs survived. Still, the mothers passed stories in the hush of night. Still, they remembered who gave names. Now, a new generation of Cayuga women rises. Some wear regalia, some wear jeans, some speak fluent Gayogo H-un, the Cayuga language, while others are learning it letter by letter. But all carry something sacred, the fire that refuses to be put out. They are artists, educators, land defenders, and knowledge keepers. They sit in courtrooms, they sing at ceremonies, and some still name the chiefs, because for the Cayuga, naming is not just assigning a label, it's breathing life into a role. It's saying, we trust you with our children's future, and no one carries that responsibility more seriously than a mother who has seen her people nearly vanish, yet still believes in their return. She watches, she waits, and when the time is right, she speaks. And so the Cayuga still walk the path, lit by matriarchs, where leadership must be earned not just with strength, but with heart, and just beyond the circle of women and chiefs sits the thread that binds them, a language with the power to heal, to return, to reclaim what was nearly lost. In the Cayuga world, dreams were not illusions, they were instructions. To sleep was to listen, to dream was to remember who you really were beneath the daily work, the ceremonies, the obligations of land and lineage. While the body rested, the spirit wandered. And in those nighttime wanderings, it sometimes brought back messages, messages too urgent to ignore. Among the Cayuga dreams were sacred conversations with the unseen world. They were not entertainment or forgotten images. They were signs, often more important than what happened while awake. A dream could reveal a hidden illness, name a future leader, or warn of a betrayal not yet made. To ignore a dream was to risk being misaligned with your own purpose. To follow it was to return to your truest self. Children were taught early to listen to their dreams, not with logic, but with intuition. If a boy dreamt of flying over a frozen river, elders might ask, "What did you feel? What color was the ice? Did anyone call your name?" These details mattered more than any literal meaning. The Cayuga believed the spirit spoke in symbols, in echoes, in feelings, and that truth was often dressed in mystery. There are stories passed down, whispers from longhouses and riverbanks, about dreams that changed everything. One tells of a woman who dreamt her unborn child spoke to her, not in words, but in a flood of music. She awoke, convinced her child would be a singer, a healer with songs. And when the child came, mute for 3 years, the clan doubted. But one night, the boy sang in his sleep, a melody no one had taught him. From then on, he was called Diohada, he who sings for the spirits. Another tale tells of a warrior who dreamed of a snake swallowing the sun. He woke, shaking, drenched in sweat. He told his clan mother. Days later, a surprise raid came at dawn, a rival group attacking in silence. But the Cayuga were waiting. They had prepared, because one man had listened to what came in the dark. Dreams also guided the sacred medicine societies. Members of these spiritual circles, especially the False Face Society, performed rituals of healing based on dream visions. They carved masks, not just from wood, but from what they saw behind closed eyes, twisted faces that scared away sickness, pulled pain from bones, and reminded the people that healing is as much spiritual as physical. Each mask was unique, each dream behind it specific. No one could ask to join the society. You had to be called in a dream. If you ignored the call, misfortune would follow, not as punishment, but as a gentle shove back toward your purpose. In this way, society blurred the lines between sleeping and waking, between medicine and mystery. They honored those who dreamed deeply. They trusted the messages that came uninvited. But colonialism tried to silence these visions. Missionaries dismissed dream interpretation as superstition. Residential schools punished native children for speaking of spirits or seeing signs. Western science labeled dreams as chemical byproducts, meaningless flickers of neurons. And yet, even under that pressure, the Cayuga dreamscape survived. It went underground, into whispers, into lullabies, into the hearts of grandmothers who never forgot. Today, the dreams are returning. Young Cayuga artists say they wake with images they don't recognize, animals they've never seen, words they don't yet understand. Some paint them, some dance them, some bring them to language classes, wondering if these symbols match old stories. Often they do. Elders smile when they hear this. They nod slowly, as if to say, the spirit never stops speaking, only we forget how to listen. Cayuga ceremonies today often begin with silence. A pause. A moment to ask, quietly, what has come in the night. Dreams are once again part of teaching, not just as curiosity, but as compass. Because in a culture that has endured invasion, removal, and suppression, dreams remain one place no one can colonize. They belong only to the dreamer, and through them, the ancestors still speak. In a world that often demands proof, the Cayuga teach something different. That truth doesn't always arrive with explanation. That healing sometimes begins with a whisper in the dark. And that guidance, if you are still enough to hear it, can arrive while the world is sleeping. So they keep dreaming. And in those dreams they keep rebuilding, because before a nation rises in waking life, it dreams itself back to life, first next. We descend from the clouds of vision into the world of rules, boundaries and bonds where families formed. Their foundations in silence, and the heart of marriage was never spoken aloud. There are nights when the smoke still rises, at least in memory. To understand the Cayuga people, you must walk through fire, not the kind that warms or feeds, but the kind that devours, the kind that leaves villages as ash and ancestors as ghosts. In the late 1700s, the Cayuga Nation, one of the original members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, faced a nightmare not born from dreams, but from steel, gunpowder, and betrayal. It was called Sullivan's Campaign in 1779, during the American Revolutionary War. General George Washington ordered a scorched earth mission to crush the Iroquois nations allied with the British. The Cayuga, along with the Seneca, Mohawk, and others, had sided with the Crown, not out of love, but out of strategy. To the American rebels, this was treason. To the Cayuga, it was survival. Washington's orders were blunt: destroy, burn villages, annihilate crops, leave no shelter, no food, no future. What came next was not a battle, it was a systematic erasure. The Cayuga homeland, rich with cornfields, orchards, and longhouses, was reduced to blackened skeletons. 40 villages in total, including sacred council sites, were torched to the ground. Their fields were plowed under, their winter food stores dumped into rivers or left to rot in the sun. Even the apple trees many planted generations before were chopped down, as if the roots of the Cayuga themselves were a threat to empire. Those who survived didn't just lose homes. They lost time, memory, continuity. Elders scattered, children went hungry, families split into fragments, fleeing in every direction. Some fled to Canada, others west. Some never found their way back. And yet the fire didn't end with Sullivan's march. Long after the soldiers left, the flames smoldered in policy, in forced removals, in broken treaties. In the war's aftermath, the Cayuga were stripped of almost all their ancestral lands. Entire lakes they once fished, entire trails they once walked, were seized by settlers or sold in silence. But war, for the Cayuga, was never just about land. It was about identity, about being told your place in the world no longer existed, that your rivers, your forests, your burial grounds were no longer yours, and yet like a stubborn ember under coals the Cayuga spirit refused to die. There are oral histories passed down that speak not just of burning, but of resilience, of women who led their families across the border, hiding sacred items in the folds of their skirts, of warriors who carried stories as if they were weapons, of grandfathers who lit fires in hidden places, whispering prayers to keep the old ways alive. For a people who lived in balance with the land, the war's trauma ran deeper than blood. The disruption wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Sacred places, once alive with song and ceremony, were reduced to memories whispered in back rooms. The bones of ancestors buried along the Cayuga Lake were lost beneath farms and fences, and yet the Cayuga kept returning, sometimes in body, always in spirit. Even now, in courtrooms and protests. Cayuga leaders fight not just for territory, but for acknowledgement that what was taken was not forgotten, that treaties signed and broken must be reckoned with, that the fires still burn not in destruction, but in remembrance. In the face of America's expansion, the Cayuga did not vanish. They adapted, they resisted, they rebuilt. Today, Cayuga people live across New York, Ontario, Oklahoma, scattered like the ashes of their villages, yet bound by a fire that never fully went out. And the irony? That same Washington who ordered the campaign, the man now carved in stone, honored on currency he earned from many native nations, the name Town Destroyer, a name not shouted in rage, but spoken in solemn truth, because for the Cayuga, the war wasn't just history, it was inheritance. It shaped who they became. It marked the beginning of a long walk through injustice, yet never a walk away from identity. Ask a Cayuga elder today about Sullivan's campaign, and they won't tell you only of fire. They'll speak of survival, of how the people kept moving, of how they carried the longhouse in their hearts when they could no longer carry it. On their land, they'll speak of ancestors who never surrendered, not to muskets, not to laws, not to time. They'll tell you, with quiet pride, that even when nations burn, memory remains. And sometimes, that memory grows stronger than fire, because from ash, new seeds grow, and those seeds are still growing across classrooms, ceremonies, and councils where young Cayuga voices speak truths. Their ancestors were once punished for saying aloud. The war burned their villages, but it did not burn their story. And now, as we follow the ashes upstream, we arrive at a quieter but no less powerful battleground, one of motherhood, kinship, and leadership, where power was not fought for, but chosen by wisdom. What kills a nation isn't always war or fire. Sometimes it's paper, a signature, a deal spoken in English but written in silence. For the Cayuga, some of the greatest wounds didn't bleed. They were ironclad. In the years after the Revolutionary War, the battlefield shifted. No more muskets, no more marching troops. Instead, courts, contracts, and land deeds. The Cayuga had already lost villages to fire. Now, they began losing the earth beneath their feet to pence and promises. The betrayal was quiet, but it was complete. The 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua was supposed to protect Cayuga lands. It guaranteed sovereignty. It promised peace. It was signed by George Washington himself, with a silver peace medal and a smile. But while the ink dried, New York State made secret land grabs behind the federal government's back-buying. Cayuga land in deals that were not only illegal, but deeply dishonest. There was no negotiation in the Longhouse, no fair exchange, sacred fire lit in unity. Just paper passed between white hands, maps drawn with unfamiliar names, boundaries carved through fields where Cayuga children had once played by the mid-1800s. The Cayuga had been stripped of nearly all their ancestral land in central New York. Over 60,000 acres vanished. No army marched through, just lawyers, lawmakers, and surveyors with agendas disguised as progress. The Cayuga were not conquered. They were erased by paperwork. But the land did not forget, and neither did the people, because what was once promised in peace became poisoned over time. The waters of Cayuga Lake, once sacred and clear, grew murky with industrial waste. The soil, once tended by generations of hands, was leached by factories, and farms that knew nothing of the stories buried beneath. In some places, burial grounds were paved over. In others, Sacred spaces were fenced in by golf courses and resorts. Even the air changed, and yet, this chapter is not only about loss. It's about resistance, written in another kind of inkwon that flows from memory, not pens. Because the Cayuga people, despite being landless in their own homeland, never gave up the fight. In the 1980s, they filed a massive land claim, the Cayuga Nation of New York v. State of New York. It was bold, powerful, and personal. They demanded justice for over 64,000 acres illegally taken in the 18th and 19th centuries. The legal battle stretched for decades, ricocheting through courtrooms like thunder long after the storm. In 2000, a federal jury awarded the Cayuga nearly $250 million in damages and rent. But the victory was short-lived. The decision was overturned. The court ruled that too much time had passed, that history had moved on. But how do you tell a people who never gave up that they waited too long? Still, the case cracked something open. It reminded the world that the Cayuga never surrendered their right to be heard. And it made something else clear. Legal erasure does not mean cultural death. Across upstate New York, the Cayuga began to return, not just in memory, but in movement. They opened health centers, cultural offices, and language revitalization programs. They reclaimed small pieces of land, building from the roots up. Even without the thousands of acres promised in treaties, they began rebuilding presence. And the pain of poisoned lands didn't just linger, it transformed. It became motivation. Environmental activists within the Cayuga Nation now lead efforts to protect watersheds, restore wetlands, and reconnect youth with the land that once sustained their ancestors. They do it with ceremony, with cedar, with seed bundles wrapped in corn husks, and through it all, there is this truth. A nation is more than lines on a map. It's stories, songs, spirits still walking the edges of the forest. Ask an elder what was lost, and they'll tell you the land was sacred. Not for what could be built on it, but for what it remembered. They'll point to trees that still whisper, to rocks that haven't been moved in centuries, to rivers that still hold names in a language many forgot, but some are learning again. The paper promises may have faded, the poison may have seeped deep, but the Cayuga have outlived both, and in every court appeal, every ceremonial planting, every child learning to say Cayuga H-un instead of Cayuga, there's a quiet rebellion, a refusal to accept that history should stay in books, because they are writing a new one, each chapter carved into bark, woven into beadwork, and sung through the smoke of sacred fires. The land is not what it once was, but the people still are. And just ahead in our story is a legacy just as powerful and just as silenced. The story of Cayuga women, not just as nurturers, but as leaders, lawgivers, and flamekeepers of a society that understood the strength of the matriarch long before the modern world remembered. There are wounds you can't see, wounds passed down like names, folded into lullabies that no longer rhyme. For the Cayuga, one of the deepest cuts came not from muskets or treaties, but from classrooms. It began with a promise of civilization, a promise made by men in suits who believed they were saving native children from their own culture. Starting in the late 1800s, Cayuga boys and girls were taken, some by force, others by fear, from the longhouses that raised them, and sent to boarding schools hundreds of miles away. The message was clear: your language is wrong, your traditions are savage, your hair, your stories, your prayers, they all must go. The children disappeared into brick buildings far from their rivers and roots, stripped of their moccasins and Names, they were given stiff uniforms and Bible verses. Their long hair was shorn with shears that didn't just cut it, humiliated. Some children bled. Some wept. All learned, quickly, not to speak Cayuga. The punishment for speaking their own language was a slap, a choke, or something worse. Soap shoved into mouths. Isolation in dark closets. Forced silence until the words dissolved from memory. At night, many cried into thin wool blankets, whispering old songs into their pillows, hoping no one would hear. Some never made it home. The boarding school knife did not spill blood in the traditional way. It sliced heritage. It carved away generations of memory. And when the children returned, they came back strangers to their families, to their land, and even to themselves. Mothers embraced sons who no longer remembered the taste of Three Sisters stew. Grandfathers asked granddaughters to help with ceremonies, and the girls looked away, unsure what to do. This was the goal. Kill the Indian. Save the man. It wasn't just cultural theft. It was identity murder. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School, Thomas Indian School, Mohawk Institute. These were not schools in the way we think of them. They were reprogramming facilities. Factories that processed Cayuga children and returned them scarred, ashamed, and severed. One Cayuga elder, years later, described it simply: "They took my childhood. Then they handed me a mirror, and I couldn't find my face in it." What does a community do when a whole generation forgets how to pray in its own tongue? When lullabies are replaced by drills and hymns? When the fire that once passed from elder to child is smothered by discipline and shame? For the Cayuga, the boarding school legacy wasn't just emotional. It was spiritual. The longhouse, once filled with laughter and dance, became quieter. Fewer hands knew how to shape a clay pipe or how to read the stars for planting. Fewer voices knew the songs to call back the animals or honor the spirits of the dead. But some embers survived. In the 1970s and 80s, survivors began to speak out. The stories spilled forwards were unshaking. Men in their 50s weeping like boys as they described standing barefoot in cold showers, told they were dirty. Women trembling as they remembered having their letters home burned if they were written in Cayuga. Those confessions sparked something powerful today. The Cayuga Nation runs cultural recovery programs that center boarding school survivors. Story circles are held where silence is not enforced but finally broken. Elders are recording testimonies, not just for history books, but for healing. Children now sit at the feet of these once silenced voices, learning the stories they were never meant to hear. In a quiet room in central New York, there is a woman teaching the Cayuga alphabet. Her grandmother never learned it. Her mother never spoke it. But she is reclaiming the syllables, one vowel at a time, like beads on a broken necklace. This is resistance. Not loud, not violent, but sacred. And there's something else, something hidden in the hearts of those who walked through those boarding school doors and came back hollow. They are not just survivors, they are bridges between what was nearly lost and what can be born again. The knife that once cut their childhoods didn't kill their roots. It just made the tree grow twisted, but still standing in every language class. Every ceremonial dance revived. Every youth gathering held on reclaimed land. There is a Cayuga child, once silenced, who now sings through another. This is not the end of the story. It's a slow, steady return to self, because what was taken in those schools can never be fully restored. But what remains can still be planted, and in the next chapter, we follow that seed, the rebirth of a language, not as an academic exercise, but as a way of returning home. A revival sung by children who were never meant to know their past. Now speaking it proudly, the Cayuga people have always known that stories don't just live in words, they live in rhythm. In the thunder of feet striking the earth, in the spiral of smoke rising into sky, in the call of a handmade drum echoing through the pines, when everything else was stripped, language, land, family, the Cayuga heartbeat survived in motion. This is the story of how that rhythm refused to die. Smoke dancing is not just a performance, it's a conversation with the spirit world, a ritual of fire, breath, and precision. Originating in the Longhouse societies of the Haudenosaunee, the smoke dance has become a symbol of cultural resistance and resilience. Fast-paced, raw, and deeply personal, it was once used to honor warriors returning from battle. Today, it honors a different kind of survival, those who fought to remain Cayuga in a world that tried to erase them. Each spin, each stomp, each turn of the foot is a word from an unwritten poem. The dancer, wrapped in shimmering beads and finely stitched regalia, moves like lightning and shadow, faster than the drum, but never without it. At first glance, it's a contest of skill, but underneath, it's a quiet declaration. I am still here. For years, the smoke dance faded. Boarding schools had trained generations to forget. Ceremonial grounds were bulldozed. Drums were silenced. And the sacred rhythms, those that once called the stars, to witness a people's joy, nearly disappeared. But some drums were buried, not broken. In the late 20th century, Cayuga artists and dancers began to dig back into memory, not dusty museum archives, but family kitchens and hushed elder circles. Old men recalled the beat with their palms on tabletops. Grandmothers closed their eyes and hummed rhythms once used to bless the harvest or mourn the dead. These fragments, scattered like feathers in wind, began to be gathered. And with them, the smoke dance was born again, not as exact replica, but as a living thing. There's power in revival, not replication, but renewal. Today, smoke dancing is a central feature at powwows and festivals across Haudenosaunee territory. And while it's often part of competitions, the spirit behind it has not changed. It remains sacred, a ritual of speed and grace, a prayer that moves. And the drum, the sacred drum, has changed too. Traditional Cayuga drums were once held close, reserved for ceremony. Their sound was not for entertainment, but for balance. When a drum sounded, it was as if the earth itself was remembering. After decades of silence, new drums had to be built. But they weren't made exactly the old way, because they couldn't be. Some of the materials were gone. Some of the songs were lost, so they rewrote them. Not to erase the past, but to honor it by continuing. Young Cayuga musicians today shape drums from wood and hide with respect, but also with innovation. Some paint their drums with symbols only their family understands. Others carve names of ancestors into the rim. And every time the mallet strikes, the skin, something ancient stirs, The rewritten drum is not a symbol of loss. It's a symbol of refusal. A refusal to be locked in museums or memories. A refusal to remain voiceless. At one recent festival, a 12-year-old Cayuga girl stood barefoot in the grass, eyes locked on the drum, heart pounding with ancestral thunder. She stepped forward, twisted, spun. Her dress caught the wind and threw back time. For that moment, she was every dancer before her, every voice that had been silenced, every child who had been told to sit still and behave. She danced for them all. In that circle, surrounded by elders and cousins, She rewrote history, not with textbooks, but with sweat and rhythm, and those watching felt it, the vibration underfoot that says the land still listens, the whisper in the leaves that says the people are still dancing. Because for the Cayuga, survival has never just been about breath or blood. It's been about memory in motion, spirit in step. The smoke dance and the drum remind us, even when a culture is wounded, its rhythm doesn't stop. It changes tempo. It adjusts to the silence. And then, when it's ready, it roars. Next we walk deeper into that roar. Not through dance, but through ink and lore. Into the story of how the Cayuga began reclaiming their stolen land. Not with weapons, but with paper, fire, and generations of persistence. The land doesn't forget. It holds memory like stone holds heat. Every footstep ever taken, every name ever whispered into wind, every grief ever buried beneath moss and pine, the land keeps it all. For the Cayuga people, the land was never just geography. It was language, identity, a living relative, and when it was taken, piece by piece, acre by acre, something more than territory was lost. What was stolen was belonging. The Cayuga were driven from their homelands in upstate New York in the late 1700s. It wasn't a single event, but a slow unraveling. Treaties that were promised and broken, borders redrawn without consent, settlers who came with paper deeds and iron axes by 1800. Most Cayuga were scattered, some pushed into Canada, others living among fellow Haudenosaunee tribes. Their ancient longhouses had vanished. Ceremonial grounds were ploughed into farmland. Sacred springs were renamed and fenced off. And for nearly 200 years, the Cayuga Nation remained officially landless. A people with no recognized home, but they never stopped remembering. Even without title or map, they told their children about the rivers that once shimmered under the moon, the hills where their ancestors hunted deer, the lakes that once reflected their ceremonies in still water. Every song, every prayer, every smoke dance carried coordinates, not in lines and numbers, but in spirit. Then, quietly and defiantly, the Cayuga began returning, not in war paint or with rifles, but with strategy, with lawsuits, with testimony, with elders who could still name every bend in the river without a GPS. In the 1980s, they filed a land claim, one of the largest in American history. It demanded recognition of a betrayal dating back to the post-Revolutionary War period, when New York State, without federal approval, illegally purchased Cayuga territory. The case dragged on for decades, winding through courts like a stream through stone. At times it seemed hopeless. The machinery, Cayuga held on, because the land had never stopped calling. Then, in the early 2000s, something extraordinary happened. Small parcels of land began returning to Cayuga hands. A few acres at first, then more, not through conquest, but through purchase, through negotiation, through community will. The land was often tired, cut by highways, polluted by old industries, but it was still sacred. And as the Cayuga began walking their homeland again, barefoot, intentional, something stirred in the roots. Children were brought to the banks of the old rivers. Elders spoke in soft tones beneath the canopy of trees that had once watched over their ancestors. Ceremonial fires were lit for the first time in generations on Cayuga earth. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a spiritual homecoming, but the return was not without pain. Some of the land had been paved over, turned into factories, parking lots, rail lines. Some trees had been poisoned. Some streams no longer sang. And yet, the Cayuga came back anyway, not expecting perfection, just presence. They cleared brush with reverence, planted seeds, not for profit, but for memory. They didn't ask the land to heal them. They promised to heal with the land. In 2021, the Cayuga opened a justice center and government office on their reclaimed territory. It wasn't just a building, it was a marker, a declaration. We are here, we never left, not really. The return to broken ground wasn't just political, it was personal. For every elder who never got to come home, a grandchild knelt in soil and whispered their name. For every ceremony lost to time, a new one was born with quiet humility, and the land, despite the scars, responded. Wildflowers began blooming in places where none had grown for years. Birds returned to trees that had long stood silent. Rain fell and the earth drank it in like forgiveness. Because when a people comes home, truly home, the ground recognizes them. It remembers the stories they once buried, the laughter it once held. And so the Cayuga walk carefully, not with anger, but with rootedness, not claiming conquest, but RECONNECTION. There are still battles, legal, cultural, environmental, but there is also joy. To see Cayuga children run barefoot where their ancestors once gathered is to watch time collapse into healing. They know this is only the beginning. The land is not yet whole, but it is no longer empty. The fire has been rekindled. And on these sacred acres, a new generation now plants, memory like seeds, determined that this time, nothing will be uprooted. Next, we step into the homes and hearts that kept these stories alive, into the kitchens, the campfires, the lullabies, to learn how Cayuga women shaped not just survival, but revival. Even when the people were gone, their names stayed behind, whispered through branches, echoed in the bends of rivers, tucked into the breath of the wind. Cayuga names lingered in the land like sacred echoes. The settlers changed what they could, cut down forests, dammed the water, and renamed hills with their own saints and generals. But the earth doesn't forget that easily, and neither do the Cayuga. Before there were borders or property lines, Cayuga country spoke its own language. Places weren't labeled, they were lived. A grove was known by the dream that was seen there, a path by the animal who first walked it. Names were not for direction, they were for meaning. Take Gaius Cayuga, meaning place of the canoe, not just a babe, but a memory of launching off toward another village. Or Onway, meaning real people, not a location, but a promise. These weren't just words, they were vessels of time. When the Cayuga were forced to leave, they carried the names in their mouths, like seeds wrapped in song. Even in faraway lands, in exile, in the dark rooms of boarding schools where their language was punished, they whispered the syllables under breath, because they weren't just words, they were directions home. Today, drive through upstate New York and you might see signs: Cayuga Lake, Cayuga Heights, Cayuga Street, but most don't know those names are bones, that every mile marker is built on someone's memory. That Cayuga isn't just a label, it's a wound and a survival. Some of the names were stolen and stripped of meaning. Others were mispronounced, anglicized, rearranged to fit a tongue that never belonged here. Still, the old names fought their way through history like roots breaking through concrete. For the Cayuga, reclaiming those names is an act of resistance. But more than that, it's an act of remembering. Language revitalization programs aren't just about speaking Cayuga again. They're about calling back the land. When a child learns to say Ganesis, they're not just learning house, they're connecting to every home that came before them. In community workshops, elders teach how to pronounce places as their ancestors did not from textbooks, but from memory. Some of those elders still carry the sounds in their bones. For others, it's a quiet rediscovery, like unearthing a necklace you thought was lost. Names have power. Colonial governments knew this. That's why they tried to erase them. They renamed rivers, renamed people, renamed spirits. If you can name something, you can claim it. But if you lose your name, you risk losing your place in the world. That's why the Cayuga never let go. Even if only whispered in ceremony, in dreams, in prayers, those names stayed alive. And today, there is a resurgence. Street signs going up in Cayuga language. School children learning the names their great-grandparents weren't allowed to say out loud. Ceremonial maps being redrawn not for tourists, but for truth. One of the most powerful stories comes from a grandmother who, when asked by her grandson where he was from, didn't give a town. She gave a word, Degayako. It means land where the canoe was taken out. She didn't need coordinates. That word was enough, because to speak a name is to keep a soul from vanishing. And the land responds. Trees stand taller when they're greeted in the old tongue. Streams seem to shimmer differently when they hear their true name. This is not romantic fantasy. It's cultural reality. Language is not just how we communicate, how we belong. And for the Cayuga, names are the fingerprints of ancestors. There are names for grief, names for joy, names for the exact color the sky turns before the first snowfall. These aren't just poetic, these are precise. And in a world that tried to flatten their culture, the Cayuga preserved a way of seeing that is layered, alive, and deeply specific. Now, new babies are being given Cayuga names, not English ones with Cayuga middle names, but full names, rooted in ceremony. That alone is a revolution. Imagine a child introduced to the world, not just with a name, but with a place, a sound that binds them to land, to spirit, to memory. That's what this chapter is. A return not just to language, but to identity. Because no matter how far the Cayuga were scattered, no matter how long they were denied their ground, the names never left the earth. They waited, and now they rise again, one word at a time, turning silence into song. Next, we follow those very voices into the long nights and early mornings, where sacred fires burn and dreams still shape the waking world in a place the settlers never understood, but the Cayuga never forgot. They tried to burn the longhouses, tried to silence the songs, tried to outlaw the drums, the words, the fires, but they could never destroy the council, because it wasn't just a room or a ritual, it was a way of thinking, a way of listening, a way of being. The Cayuga Grand Council still gathers, not always in wood-planked longhouses as before, but under stars, in community centers, sometimes even over Zoom. And still, when they speak, the voices do not belong to individuals. They belong to the people, the ancestors, the future. For the Cayuga leadership was never about control. It was about balance. Chiefs were not chosen for power, they were chosen for patience, clarity, and how deeply they could listen. Women held the right to select and remove them. Elders weighed the hearts of men, not just their opinions. And every voice mattered. The Haudenosaunee system, which the Cayuga helped shape, was among the oldest participatory democracies in the world. When Europeans arrived, they didn't understand it. They saw no kings, no military hierarchy, no written constitution only, a circle of men and women passing a sacred wampum belt and speaking in turns. But what they didn't see was the strength in that slowness. Decisions were not made in a rush. The council could take days, even weeks, to decide, because agreement was more powerful than majority. Unity was law. Inside the council fire, there was no shouting, no cutting one another off. A speaker would rise, place a token on the floor, perhaps a carved shell, a polished stone, and speak only while holding it. When they finished, they passed it on. It was more than a rule. It was a rhythm. That rhythm still echoes today. Modern Cayuga councils face modern problems: land rights, environmental protections, language revival, political recognition. But the way they gather hasn't lost its roots. Elders still sit at the heart of the circle. The air still carries the gravity of ceremony, and the sacred wampum belts, those living records of law and memory, are still brought out, touched, read aloud in the ancient tongue. Each belt tells a story of alliances made, battles survived, betrayals endured. Each notch and bead holds a truth passed down not by book, but by voice and breath. There's one belt in particular, the Hiawatha belt, that stands for the unity of the Haudenosaunee nations. A white pine in the center, roots stretching in all four directions, a symbol of peace created long before America had states or presidents. The Cayugas sit on that belt, right between the Onondaga and the... Today, Cayuga youth are learning what those belts mean. Not just the words, but the responsibilities. In youth councils, children take turns chairing meetings, practicing consensus, reawakening what colonization tried to crush: indigenous governance. That was never broken, only buried. One story speaks volumes. A 14-year-old girl, nervous, stood up at a community council and offered an idea to preserve the riverbanks. Her suggestions, simple, was noted. A week later, it became tribal policy, because her voice mattered, and because the council still listens. But the path here wasn't easy. In the early 20th century, the Cayuga Council nearly went quiet. Many were forced into US government structures. Elections replaced clan mother appointments. Councils were labeled primitive. Funding disappeared. Records were burned. Ceremonial spaces were paved over. And yet the people held on. In backyards, in basements, in whispered prayers. In the 1970s, something shifted. A wave of cultural reclamation rose. Grandmothers came forward with stories. Old recordings surfaced. The youth returned to the elders, asking not just for history, but for tools. The council rose again, not in defiance, but in revival today. Cayuga Council members wear both regalia and jeans. They sit with laptops open and sacred items on the table. They navigate treaties, lawsuits, and digital databases, but always with the same fire in their center. A belief that no decision made in haste can ever honor the past or protect the unborn, because that's the heart of it. In every meeting, the Cayuga Council speaks for the 7th generation, not just the next election, not just this decade, but for the children who aren't even dreams yet. Imagine a country run that way. Imagine if every bill passed had to pass through the hearts of grandmothers, the eyes of children, and the memories of ancestors. That is how the Cayuga Council still moves, like a river shaped by stone, not fast, but eternal. And even in conflict, the circle holds. Disagreement is not failure, it's proof that many minds are present, that the people are alive. So when we speak of survival, it's not just about land or language. It's about decision-making, about self, about the sacred responsibility to carry the flame without burning the forest, and that flame still flickers in Cayuga hands. In a world obsessed with speed, they have chosen ceremony. In a world that divides, they still gather in circles. In a world that forgets, they remember and remind now. As we move toward the final chapter, we step into the heartbeat of their survival. Not just what they've held on to, but what they've passed forward. Their last embers of tradition, still glowing, still warm, because the fire that was lit in the longhouse long ago was never meant to burn out. Some homes are built from timber and stone. Others are built from memory and blood. For the Cayuga, the longhouse is not just something they lived in, it's something they lived through. Even when it's gone, even when it's ash, even when it's replaced by parking lots or offices or silence. Because the longhouse was never just a building. It was an idea, a way of living together, a way of listening, eating, deciding, dreaming together. A spine made of cedar, covered in bark, breathing the smoke of cook fires and stories. But even more, it was a symbol of how a family becomes. A nation inside, dozens of relatives, sometimes 5, 6 generations, would live under one roof. Each fire pit was a chapter, each rafter a branch of lineage, and above it all, the high open space where smoke drifted upward, carrying the voices of the people to the stars. The longhouse taught the Cayuga how to share, how to pause, how to hold space for one another. The children learned by watching. The elders led without shouting. The clan mothers moved through the corridor like quiet thunder, guiding decisions not through commands, but through care. Even after they were pushed from their land, even after colonial wars scattered their families, Cayuga people kept building longhouses in the places they were forced to live. Sometimes not physical ones, but emotional ones. Circles of community where no one was left out, no matter how far they were from the original homelands. And today, that spirit still lives in them. You see it in the way Cayuga youth return to language classes after school, in the way grandmothers teach songs while peeling corn, in the way people gather at funerals, naming ancestors out loud, linking the living with the dead in a chain of breath and sound. The longhouse lives in how they argue and forgive, how they speak and listen. It shapes how they run councils and raise children. It teaches them that everyone, from the baby in the cradle board to the old man with shaking hands, has a place by the fire. You can take a people from their homes. You can remove them from rivers and forests and clay. But if the home was built into their way of thinking, if it's sewn into their soul, then it never leaves. The longhouse became something portable, something carved, not from trees anymore, but from tradition in the 21st century. The Cayuga longhouse survives in school programs, in intergenerational powwows, in online classes where kids learn clan names and origin stories. But more importantly, it survives in the value system: respect, consensus, patience, the 7-generation view. One Cayuga elder once said, "We don't just rebuild our nation with laws. We rebuild it by setting up the longhouse again, inside our hearts." That's how they've endured. Not just through protest, not just through survival, but through cultural architecture. The kind that doesn't need bricks or nails. The kind that's passed through lullabies, discipline, and dinner tables. And now, as climate changes and modern life threaten sacred land once more, the Cayuga response is the same. Not to panic, but to gather, to form a circle. to speak, to listen, to protect the earth, not as owners, but as relatives. The Longhouse teaches that we do not inherit the land, we borrow it from the children yet to be born. It teaches that history is not behind us, but walking beside us, and that no one can decide the future of the people without hearing the oldest stories first. This is not nostalgia. This is survival. To outsiders, the Longhouse might look like a relic, but to the Cayuga, it is a compass, a map for how to move through the world with grace and integrity. Even if the roof leaks, even if the walls collapse, the bones still stand. So when a Cayuga child speaks, their first word in the Onondaga dialect, that's the Longhouse speaking. When a young mother braids her daughter's hair while humming an old seed-planting song, that's the Longhouse singing. And when an elder places a hand on the ground and says, "We're still here," that is the Longhouse breathing. This chapter of the Cayuga story does not end with a fire burning out. It ends with coals being carried, passed hand to hand, soul to soul, so that wherever they go, wherever the people are scattered, they can always build home again, because they carry it in muscle, in memory, in the marrow of who they are. They carry the Longhouse in their bones, and no paper law, no stolen treaty, no erased name can take that away. This is not the end of their story. This is the fire under the next generation's feet, and it begins with a single breath, with a drumbeat, with a whisper inside a cedar-walled memory that says, "Build again, speak again, remember, always."